Okay, welcome everyone. Good morning. This is the EEOST Capital Fund information session. And thank you for taking the time to participate in this session with us this morning. My name is Teresa Jordan and I am the director of the Children's Investment Fund. And before we get started, I'll just go over a few logistics. All attendees are on mute and the chat function is disabled because we will be using the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. So please use the Q&A if you are planning to ask a question. We may address some of your questions throughout the webinar by typing in our answers, but we will also leave time at the end of the webinar for a Q&A session. So we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions and answers. Just to note that we will be recording this webinar. The slides will be shared with all of the registrants afterwards, and we will post this recording also on Combis, where you found the application for EEOST. And then lastly, also, we'd like to just note that these grants are for center-based programs only. We saw that there were some family child care providers that had registered for this session, so we wanted to just make sure that you know up front that family child care providers are not eligible for this funding, unfortunately. Next slide, please. So we are hosting two sessions. So there's today and then another session on Thursday at 6:30. We wanted to make sure that if providers, had an option of attending during the day or after hours. And then the purpose of the information session is to really go through the application process and the grant conditions, talk about changes from fiscal 22, so the last round that we had, and this round is fiscal 23. We'll go through the timeline, and then again, we will have the Q&A session. So presenting with me today are Neil Flynn, who is the Deputy General Counsel at EEC, and Bree Horwitz, who is the Senior Project Manager at the Children's Investment Fund. And I will now turn it over to Neil.
Thank you very much, Teresa. Good morning, everyone. In these next few slides, I'm going to begin an overview of the EEOST program. The Early Education and Out-of-School Time Capital Fund was created by statute, specifically an act financing the production and preservation of housing for low and moderate income residents in 2013. That statute was reauthorized in 2018. The EEOST Capital Fund provides grants to tax-exempt nonprofit organizations or organizations in which a nonprofit organization has a controlling interest. The eligible organization shall use these grant funds to develop and/or rehabilitate eligible facilities in which at least 50% of the slots in the facility shall serve low-income families who are eligible for public subsidy. This year, $6.2 million in grant funding has been allocated for the EEOST Capital Fund program. Next slide, please. EEC has designated CDAC, the Community Economic Development Assistance Corporation, to administer the EEOST program. CIF, the Children's Investment Fund, which is affiliated with CDAC, provides technical assistance and financing to early childhood education and out-of-school time facilities across Massachusetts. CDAC and CIF has worked with EEC in development of grant review standards and will continue to administer the grants that EEC awards. Since the first round in fiscal year 2014, the state has invested $43 million in 90 projects throughout the state. For the past two rounds, fiscal year 21 and 22, EEC and Children's Investment Fund modified the EEOST Capital Fund in order to respond to the needs of early childhood education and out-of-school time providers during the COVID-19 pandemic. This year's round in fiscal year 23 is similar to the modified rounds in fiscal year 21 and 22, and we'll provide more specifics regarding that shortly. Next slide, please. Just an overview here of an eligible facility in relation to the grant program. As defined in the regulations, a building or structure that is or will be owned or leased by one or more eligible organizations and licensed by EEC, provided that A, at least 50% of the slots in the facility shall serve low-income families, as I previously mentioned, and also that a leased facility shall be leased from a bona fide third party, meaning not from an entity affiliated in any way with the eligible organization, and shall have a lease term that is consistent with the scale of the capital investment, but not to be less than 5 years from the date of completion of the eligible project. Lastly, the facility shall meet all of the requirements of 606 CMR 15.00, the regulations governing this grant program. As outlined in the guidelines, eligible facilities include sites that comply with Mass General Laws, Chapter 15D, and all regulations and policies adopted thereunder. Eligible facilities must also comply with all other applicable federal, state, and local statutes, regulations, and ordinances. To name a few are the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, as well as the Massachusetts State Building Code, SBC. As of the date of the EEOST application, eligible programs must serve at least 50% of their slots must serve low-income families or those receiving public subsidy. Next slide, please. A few other notes regarding eligible facilities. If a building, structure, or site is leased, then the leased facilities shall have a lease term that is consistent with the scale of the capital investment, but shall not be less than 5 years. Also, if a building, structure, or site is or will be municipally owned building that dedicates a single purpose space for licensed early education or out-of-school time programs, then the lease must be for not less than 5 years. Next slide, please. Just a few points here in regards to partnerships. A for-profit may act in a joint venture with a nonprofit developer. The nonprofit partner is required to have at least a 51% controlling interest, meaning a financial or managerial interest in the joint venture. Organizational documents of the for-profit must be provided along with a description of nonprofit's controlling interest in the nonprofit's organizational documents. None of the members of the partnership, either for-profit or nonprofit, can profit or benefit in any way from EEOST funding. Next slide, please. Thank you. The grant agreement will include language regarding a land use obligation that ensures continued use of the property for large group and school-aged childcare for a specific term. For all program sites, whether leased or owned, it is a 5-year term. The obligation may be released under the following conditions upon completion of the grant term. If a project were to be foreclosed on by a mortgage holder of a bona fide first mortgage, the obligation will also be released with EEC's consent and in the event of a grant recapture, which I'll discuss on the next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. If the eligible project or facility is found to be in non-compliance with any EEC regulation or policy, the terms and provisions of the EEOST grant documents, or with any other federal, state, or local laws, regulations, ordinances, or policies, the grantee will have 90 days to rectify those matters in a manner acceptable to EEC prior to the recapture of any funds. Compliance with the various regulations and policies, etc., will be determined at the sole discretion of EEC. If for any reason the grantee fails to comply with the terms and provisions of the grant agreement, CDAC, CIF, or EEC will recapture the grant funds according to a schedule that is provided in our EEOST guidelines. Next slide, please. And this slide here basically runs through the recapture schedule that can be found in our guidelines. Essentially, if the event of default occurs on a date that is on or before a certain anniversary of the project completion deadline, then a certain percentage, of the grant proceeds shall be recaptured and repaid to the grantor. For example, as you can see on this slide, if the event or default occurs, say, on a date that is after the first anniversary, but on or before the second anniversary of the project completion deadline, then 80% of the grant proceeds shall be recaptured. The percentage of recapture, as you can see on the schedule, decreases as time elapses. Next slide, please. And I am now going to turn this next slide over to Teresa. Thank you, Teresa.
Great, thanks, Neil. So what you see here are the similarities and changes, and these are similarities and changes that are compared to the fiscal 22 EEOST round. So the first one here is organizations whose projects are 100% complete at the time of the application cannot apply for EEOST funding for reimbursement. And the reason for that is that we are most interested in projects that are in the earlier stages. So they're projects that are not fully complete. We would like to help organizations by providing technical assistance that might be needed to create your high quality project. Also, we will continue to focus on projects that address health and safety issues, emergency repairs, and accessibility modifications. So those are the similarities. The changes this year, what we found due to construction cost increases and supply chain issues, really not being able to access equipment and materials as easily and quickly as we had in the past pre-COVID, we have decided with EEC to increase the amount of funding that organizations can apply for because the projects are coming in much more expensive with all of these issues that they're faced with. So last year, the grants were between 100 to 250,000. This year, they are between 200,000 and 500,000 is what you can apply for. So, and then the last bullet here is if you received a grant during what we call the traditional round, and that is when we were providing grants up to $1 million. And so that would be a grant between fiscal 14 and fiscal 20. And if you don't know, if you know you received $1 million grant, but don't know which fiscal year, we could certainly let you know that. So you would be eligible to apply for a grant for fiscal 23 for the same site, but that's only if you did not apply last year or the year before and receive funding. Next slide, please. Okay, so here, again, the range is between 200,000 and 500,000, but EEOST can be used to pay for the entire cost of a project. So if your project costs $450,000, you can apply to EEOST for $450,000. So it's, you know, any amount between 200 and 500,000. Your request has to be at least $200,000. The request can exceed 500,000. And what we would need to know is that you have evidence of other funding sources that would pay the difference. So if your total project cost is $700,000, you can apply to EEOST for the 500. That $200,000, we would need to know whether it's your organization that is going to provide equity, or you have a grant from a foundation, or you have a loan from a bank or some other entity, but we would need evidence of that. So a letter that shows us that that funding is committed to this particular project. Again, all of that has to happen at the time of application, which is December 8th. So you would need to provide evidence at that time. And you can't submit an application for reimbursement on a project that is 100% complete. But if only a portion of your project has been completed and you have other work to do, we would ask you to submit invoices and details on what has been completed and when that work was done. Next slide, please. So project readiness is one of the key requirements to being competitive for EEOST. Readiness is determined by your ability to complete a full financial closing and start construction by December 31st of next year, of 2023. So again, any funding needed above 500,000 must be demonstrated in the application that you submit on December 8th. If your project is complicated, meaning if it involves construction, moving walls, flooring, ceilings, all of that, then you need to have already hired an architect or an HVAC consultant if it's very complicated in order to be competitive. Bree will talk more about the cost estimates and professionals that are needed based on the type of project that you're applying for. So we'll get into that a little later. Next slide, please. So these are the eligible uses of funds, and we just created these 5 areas just to point out. So it could be improvements to outdoor play spaces. That could be installing resilient surfacing or replacing old playground equipment. You could use the funds to improve your heating and air conditioning system, or window replacement for old and inoperable windows that may be needed in the space. It can be used to reconfigure space. So if you're planning to expand your program, to increase the space that you currently have. So you may have space that was not being used, and now you want to create a bathroom or a gross motor room. It can be used to do that. It can also be used for emergency repairs. So it may be that you are replacing exit signs or addressing plumbing issues or electrical upgrades. The one thing it can't be used for is information technology that we have here. So any upgrades or purchases of equipment or computers are not eligible for funding if it's information, if it's IT. And then lastly, we have physical environment modifications. And so that would be if you're planning to add a mobility ramp or do some elevator upgrades that are needed. We've seen those projects, as well as replacing door handles and fixtures. Next slide, please. So here we organize the uses of the grant into these 5 categories. And over the last 2 fiscal years, these are the types of projects that we actually have funded. So this list appears as an Appendix A in the application, and it's not an exhaustive list. So there may be things on here that, you know, or we may not have something on here that you're thinking about. So the first category would be capital improvements to outdoor play spaces. The second is improvements to air quality through the HVAC system, reconfiguration of indoor spaces. Next slide, please. Category 4 is emergency repairs that impact the health and safety of the children and the educators that are using the space. Again, that's replacing a roof or doing upgrades to the electrical system. And then category 5 are the physical environment modifications, including accessibility. The one thing to note here is that funds cannot be used to purchase, to pay for, funds cannot be used to acquire buildings or land. So it's not, the EEOST grant can't be used as an acquisition grant. Next slide, please. So Neil mentioned that, you know, the eligibility criteria earlier. So you have to be a licensed program in good standing with EEC. You need to be a Chapter 180 nonprofit organization and a 501c3 tax exempt as well. No one on your board can financially benefit from the EEOST funding. So if you have an architect on your board, that person cannot be the architect that you hire, that you pay using the EEOST funds. And lastly, organizations can only submit an application for one site. So if you have multiple sites, you would need to decide which site to submit an application on. And there's only one application per organization, but also it cannot be the site if you submitted an application and were funded in fiscal 21 or fiscal 22. You cannot submit an application in fiscal 23 for that same site. It would have to be a different site. Next slide, please. Okay, so once the legal closing process for the grant happens, the EEOST funds will be dispersed. So we disperse on a reimbursement basis for any expenses that were incurred after January of this year. So if you hired your architect 2 months ago to get started on designing the space that you're planning to apply for through this grant, the fees for that architect is an eligible expense in the EEOST budget. So we can reimburse you for what you're paying the architect for their work, for any work that's happened after January 1st of 2022. In terms of legal closing costs, grantees will be responsible for the EEOST attorney's legal expenses and your own attorney's legal expenses. And that cost is typically between up to about $6,000, and we're seeing it come in a little less than that. But you would, and the good news is that for your attorney and for the EEOST attorney, those expenses, which total about $12,000, that can be included. Those are eligible expenses to add to your EEOST budget. So when you request funds from us, it can include that $12,000. Projects must start construction again by December of 2023. Again, the full financial closing, meaning the legal closing with our attorney and your attorney and starting construction, all of that we expect by December of 2023. We have seen in the past couple of years that, there are extensions that need to be made because, projects are moving along and there are things that happen. So, but that is a milestone that we set initially. And then for any projects that require construction, grantees will be required to hire a construction project manager to monitor the construction on their behalf. The good news is that again, this is an expense that you can include in your EEOST budget. We at EEOST will also have a construction monitor, but that is not a cost that you will pay for. The EEOST program will be responsible for that expense. And I will now turn it over to Bree.
Thank you, Teresa. Good morning, everyone. This year's EEOST round will consider a range of projects entailing construction in one or more of the 5 major development areas that Teresa shared. Applicants will need to assemble a team of qualified professionals to plan, implement, and start the work proposed in the application by December 31st, 2023. Whom your organization will hire will vary based on the complexity of your project. If you are expanding or reconfiguring your building, your project team may include architects, general contractors, owners, construction managers, and structural engineers. If you are planning major site work or building a playground, those projects can necessitate hiring design professionals, including playground designers, landscape architects, site engineers, and surveyors. For projects that entail the replacement or repair, significant repairs of heating, ventilation, and conditioning systems, HVAC, your project team may include mechanical engineers to assess the current conditions within your buildings and recommend changes to the system configurations. You will need to hire qualified professionals, as Teresa mentioned, to oversee the development of plans and specifications and ensure that the work that's completed corresponds to those plans and is of high quality. You can apply with projects entailing minor construction, which might be discrete projects like the replacement of a roof or windows throughout your program, by hiring a few specialized contractors where you may not need an architect. Either way, all contractors that you hire through this program need to be licensed in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for that particular trade. They need to be insured and bonded. All applications must include invoices or recent estimates, and to be awarded EEOST and be able to requisition the grant funds, will need to see a contract with all professionals that you've hired, and you will have made proper diligence and submitted that for our review. So that can include obtaining permits and other approvals through your city or town. You do not need to pull the construction permit at the time of application, but please do submit everything that you have up until this point to be considered. Internal employees and board members can advise on these projects. If you do have internal employees to oversee the work, like facilities managers who are qualified professionals that have the capacity to oversee the project and lead the construction team, that's fine. But as Teresa mentioned, as with prior years, if you're relying on the labor and talent of board members or others affiliated with your organization, those folks cannot be paid. They must be volunteers or working pro bono. Next slide, please. So please reference the procurement information on combis that Teresa and Neil described to determine whether your proposed project meets the criteria for EEOST this year. There's a checklist that includes documentation of the scope of work and costs for your proposal. Please ensure that all requested documentation is included in the application submission. If you're missing items off of this checklist, your application will not be considered complete and may be disqualified for further review, excuse me. If specific answers or aspects within the application questions are not applicable to your project, just indicate that within the checklist and within the application. All applications must be submitted to EEC via email by Thursday, December 8th at 4 p.m. EEC will complete a preliminary review to determine that each application concerns an eligible facility and that has a license in good standing, and that each organization's in good financial standing with EEC. And then all eligible applications will be forwarded to the Children's Investment Fund for review and evaluation. Next slide, please. So the application document itself is largely a narrative of the problems that you're trying to address with the proposed scope of work. There is no limit to the word count. Please answer all questions as completely as possible, and you can also indicate if a question is not applicable to your project. Again, please triple check that checklist. Questions can be submitted to EEC via email after today's session. Please submit them by November 3rd at 4 p.m. And at the end of this presentation, we'll discuss how to submit questions. Questions from the information sessions with their answers will be posted on combis on or around November 15th. You can email the application to EEC at the address there, and EEC will send an automated confirmation for all emails received. This doesn't indicate that your application is complete, just that it was received and processed by EEC. Please CC yourself on the application submission email, just in case there are issues with your submittal. There are lots of checklist items and attachments, so please look into utilizing a compression service like WinZip or zip file to ensure that all documents can be submitted in one or a couple of emails to EEC, and ensure that they are not too large for the system to process them. Applications received after the deadline of 4 p.m. will not be considered. This year, we will be hosting virtual site visits in January, which are a meeting of about 50 minutes. That's an opportunity for the EEOST review team to ask questions to clarify your application. You will be asked to bring members of your project team that include the professionals that you've retained, as well as your internal team. You want to ensure that you have folks from your team that are able to answer questions about the costs, the scope, the timeline, the project and construction management, your child care programs, your building, your design, and specifics regarding the engineering details, and also the management of your organization. We will send you a list of suggested professionals to bring that were referenced within your application. The state's EEOST review team includes architects with a specialization in child care environments, and those folks will examine projects entailing design, major construction, accessibility, and other code compliance issues. We will have mechanical engineers to review all HVAC projects in terms of looking at the engineering specifications and the equipment specifications that you are proposing. And we will have construction advisors to review the invoices, the proposals, the costs within your application. Your team can share information for clarification purposes during this virtual site visit. Unfortunately, we can't consider entirely new information like an entirely new scope of work at that time. And we cannot accept new documentation that's submitted as part of the site visit to be considered within the application at that point. You can share with us updates from the time of the application in terms of new funding or new costs that you discovered, updated costs, but we cannot accept new documentation like entirely new plans that you're submitting at that point. Next slide, please. So our scoring is on a 100-point scale. Each project is going to be scored independently on the materials within the application and shared at the site visit. One of the largest areas is the accurate presentation and documentation of project costs, which is 30% of the score. And so this is how clearly the application documents the problem to be solved, remedied through the project, and how it meets some or all of the 5 priority categories of this year's EEOST program. So the review team will look at the description of the project and the documentation, photos that you've submitted of the problem areas at your site, documentation of the project costs, including how thorough the estimates are, how recent they are, invoices for work already completed. We look to see that a qualified professional has documented the full scope of your proposed work, including the company name and the date of the estimate. We look for a complete development budget of all expenses relating to the construction for the project, breaking out the cost of labor and materials ideally, and sources and uses budget that also indicates non-construction soft costs like the professionals you hire, including the legal expenses that Teresa mentioned, the costs for design and engineering services, as well as any other sources that will be funding the project. For construction projects that are major, we will look for plans documenting the work to be completed. So that could include architectural plans, engineering plans, a floor plan of your site to understand how rooms are situated near each other, site plans for outdoor projects, mechanical plumbing and engineering plans. And these plans can be schematic or design development. They can be fairly preliminary. You don't need to submit construction level drawings at this point, unless your project is already at that stage. We also look for if you're appropriate documentation of if you're doing major construction, we need to ensure that diligence was completed to do the work safely. So that includes environmental reports, like a phase 1 environmental site assessment if you're doing outdoor work in a play area or expanding your outdoor play area into new spaces. We look for hazardous materials reports to assess the presence of lead or asbestos within the past 2 years if you are disrupting surfaces that may contain hazardous materials. If you haven't completed these reports yet, but plan to do so, please note that within the application. The next scoring area is readiness and feasibility. And so that is also 30 points. And there we look to see if the applicant organization has sufficient resources in place to successfully carry out the work. So that includes retaining the appropriate professionals on the project team with the proper qualifications to do the work. Can the project progress to meet the pre-closing conditions and start construction work by the end of the calendar year 2023? If the project will, the project's construction will interfere with daily operations, like a replacement of an HVAC system may, does your application discuss plans to relocate your programs, and is there a cost for that within the budget? If your schedule includes winter conditions, how does that impact construction and your timeline? And if the project costs exceed your EEOST request, have you identified other sources within the application that are already committed and available that can go into your project to cover any gap in your project cost and the amount you're requesting from EEOST. So these sources, as Teresa mentioned, could be a loan, it could be fundraising, a line of credit, it could be your organization's internal equity as well. But we will need to see evidence that those sources are committed and available to go into the project by the time the project is ready to start construction. For financial stability, this is a 10-point section, and we understand that COVID and challenges with staffing are impacting programs across the Commonwealth. Applicants will not be penalized for operating at a reduced capacity. The application asks for historic financial information, including a board-approved operating budget, your most recent audited financials, your current year balance sheet and profit and loss statement, and also the management letters, 3 years worth of management letters, which are within your audit. Those management letters, they are addressed to the board, and if they indicate significant findings or material deficiencies, we want to know how your organization addressed those through changes to your operations to remedy the issues. We will also look at your audit to see your organization's performance over the prior year. If your organization has a deficit, we need to understand the factors that have changed in terms of your enrollment and your operations, and can talk about how your operations may change moving forward. But if you are having a deficit either this year or last year, it is not a deal breaker. We just need to understand what's going on. Next slide, please. So there are preference points that are 5 points each in 6 areas. So these are factors that are about where your program is located and who your program serves. EEOST program looks for a balanced geographic plan that includes projects across the state, and there is a preference given to projects in central Massachusetts and Cape Cod and the islands. We look to facilities where the number of childcare slots that serve families receiving public subsidies exceeds 80% of the total childcare slots as of the date of the EEOST application. So again, 50% is statutory, but for organizations that are able to serve up to 80% or more, 80% or more affordable slots, they receive preference points there. For programs that serve one or more of EEC's priority populations, which include homeless children, families in supportive childcare, or young parents, they receive preference points. Projects that specifically address accessibility for individuals with special needs. Projects that are located in one of the 26 cities or towns within the Commonwealth. You can Google for a list. And project teams that have solicited businesses or contractors that are certified by the State Supplier Diversity Office. So these include minority business enterprises, women-owned business enterprises, and others. You can find a complete list on the SDO website. Next slide, please. So this is the timeline that I've already covered, but essentially written questions submitted to EEC will be answered by the 15th. The application deadline is December 8th at 4 p.m. The review process extends from December through March 2023, and that includes those virtual site visits to clarify items in the application. Our target for announcements is June 2023, and then projects that are awarded a conditional grant of the EEOST will move forward on their projects with project support from the Children's Investment Fund, and will be working to answer the project-specific and general conditions that are outlined in the award letter to define the project, to close on the grant, and to start construction by December 31st. Projects can start construction and close on the grant before then if they are ready to do so. Next slide, please. So what follows here are excerpts from the charts and budgets within the application. These are Excel spreadsheets with 3 tabs that will be attached to your application. The pink areas are auto-calculating in Excel. This is just the top portion of the development budget. So here is where you will describe the different improvements, or construction that you plan to implement that respond to those 5 program areas that Teresa had mentioned earlier. So you would note here, if you are replacing, say, 20 windows or replacing sinks in 5 classrooms, you would document the cost of the project here. Next slide, please, is a sources and uses budget. So this is the total cost for the project. If your project for EEOST is part of a larger budget, please submit the total budget, the total sources and uses for the entire project, as well as the sources and uses for just this portion of the project that will be supported by EEOST. For example, if you are renovating a building that has other uses as well, like a fitness facility or offices, you can have the total cost of the project, but then separately list out the cost of the improvements to the childcare area. So this is where you would note all of the project costs, again, including construction, the soft costs, and on the other side, the sources that will fund the project. This is where you would know if there's debt, fundraising, or internal equity for the project. And again, the pink auto calculates there. We've entered in the legal costs there for the EEOST attorney, but you'll have to enter in the ones for your attorney as well. Next slide, please. So this is a chart of your enrollment as of the date of the application. So this is where you would note your license capacity, your current enrollment, and the number of slots supported through public subsidies, those supported through private pay, and those that are subsidized through your organization through scholarships or other discounts. And so this is one of the ways that we factor whether your program meets the affordability requirements of the program. Again, it auto-calculates the percentage of affordable slots. The next slide, I'll turn it back over to Neil to discuss other additional subsidies that you can reflect in your application.
Thank you, Bree. Appendix D here shows a chart that you would only fill out if your enrollment as of the date of the application demonstrates subsidy slots representing less than 50% of the total enrollment. You would fill out this chart for children in your program who receive other public subsidies that as of the date of the application, but are not currently in an EEC or Head Start subsidized slot. A list of some of the other public subsidies that would be eligible include SSDI, SSI, SNAP, WIC, and the chart that you would fill out is illustrated here below. You must have documentation available for families receiving other public subsidies and be able to demonstrate that those subsidies are being received by children in your program and document it. You know, one way of obtaining this information would be perhaps by using some form of anonymous online survey tool. But if awarded the grant, you must maintain on file each year for the term of the grant this information. Children and families who receive other public subsidies that may be eligible to basically get the program over that 50% threshold previously discussed.
Thank you. And we can move on to the next slide. So again, for technical assistance regarding the real estate development aspects of your project, you can email the Children's Investment Fund at this email address. The technical assistance cannot be about specific application questions about your application or requirements. Those questions should be directed to EEC at the address here. And with that, I believe we will move on to the Q&A section.
Great, thanks, Bree. I'm Kira Wilkie with the Children's Investment Fund team, and thank you for putting all your questions in, and you can keep them coming. We'll see if we can answer most of them in the next 15 minutes. The first question is for you, Teresa. We operate Head Start programming, and the building is 100% federal interest for Head Start. Is the building eligible?
Yes, the building is eligible to apply. It's at the time that we close with the attorney. Head Start would be involved in signing off on the land use obligation. So that would be the difference there, is that the Head Start would have to give authorization because they have the initial interest in the building, which is what we would look at as a first mortgage, but it's what they consider federal interest.
All right, great. And we had two questions that are involving new sites. It sounds like they're not currently operational at the moment. So can you talk a little bit about what would be required for the applicant organization to do, whether that would be eligible? But one was a new site to begin serving Head Start that they need to renovate. And the other was they were asking about a playground that they'd like to look at, but it sounds like the organization is licensed by EEC, but the new site would not yet be licensed necessarily at the moment.
For me?
Yeah.
Okay. So in those two cases, I would say the organization, as long as the organization is licensed and this is a new space that they are planning to seek a license on. One is Head Start. I think I did see that question. One is a Head Start program.
Yes.
So, and I think it mentioned that the reason it's not open yet is because there is no. Can you read the question, Kira? I just want to make sure I'm taking them separately and not together.
If we
I'm just
have a
trying to
new
find
site that needs to be renovated in order to serve our Head Start funded enrollment, is that new site an eligible project? Currently, children are not being served due to a lack of facilities in the community.
So that new site would be eligible. It would be helpful to learn more about the project though. So if you could actually submit some questions and give us some more background, and we can start to email back and forth through the web address that was on the last slide. We would just like to understand a little bit more about the project. So it would be helpful before you submit an application.
And then the other one says, we are building a new center for our children and should be able to transition the children into the new building in January. Could we use these funds for playgrounds for the new building?
Yes, it would be eligible for playground renovation or equipment, as long as the new building is a building that you're currently a licensed program, and this building will be licensed at the time that we are reviewing the application, or will be licensed. Again, I would say on this one, we would like to have more information. So if you could submit that question and through the email address so that we can start a dialogue with you about the specifics of timing, because it's all about a timing issue and what the costs are for the project, what you're looking at in terms of the cost for the playground renovation, and when you're expecting the site to be up and running and operational. So it would be helpful to hear a little bit more.
Okay, great. This question is for Bree. You talked about the major and minor projects. Do people have to worry about that too much? The question is adding a bathroom to an existing site considered a major or minor project? And how do I know if I need an engineer or can just get 3 bids for the work?
Okay, well, if you're creating a restroom in an area that currently does not have plumbing or ventilation, then that is going to entail tapping into the systems within your building. And that may be, you will need an architect most likely to determine how the new restroom will connect to those different systems within your building. A general contractor may be able to do it, but you want to ensure that if the project entails any kind of complication or involvement of your systems, your multiple systems within your building, that you can address that through the scope of your project and hiring the correct folks. So I would say for that project that you're proposing, it makes sense to consult with an architect, not only for the construction elements, but also for code. You want to ensure that the project complies with your local plumbing code regarding the number of sinks and toilets for the number of occupants in your building, both children and adults. So I would say there it makes sense to connect with an architect.
Great. And another question, Bree, do we need 3 bids prior to submitting the application?
You don't, it's always ideal to get more than one bid, especially with such a volatile construction environment like we're seeing now with pricing all over the place. Getting more than one bid or estimate will help you understand if there is a scarcity of certain materials or equipment that you are retaining, like with HVAC equipment over the past year. Some pieces of equipment were back ordered, 6 months or so. So you want to ensure that you are working with a qualified contractor that can give you a real sense of not only costs, but timeline and any procurement challenges there. So I would say it's always a good idea to get more than one. If you do get the EEOST grant awarded, you will need to provide the 3 estimates for the construction work.
Great. A question for Teresa. We are a nonprofit in a church. We do not own our space, but we rent from the church. Is this something that would affect our eligibility?
This is another question that actually requires more information, but if it is a program that is separate from the church, right? So it is an independent program, you are a separate nonprofit organization, tax exempt, you have your own audited financials, and you are leasing space from the church, and you have a lease that is in effect for at least the next 5 years, because the grant is a 5-year grant, then yes, you would be eligible to apply. If there's something different in some of those things, then again, I would suggest that you submit a question through the email address so that we can start to have a dialogue with you specifically about some things that may not follow the criteria that I just laid out. So great question.
And another question, Teresa, and this also might involve some other follow-up, are Catholic schools that are license eligible? Are Catholic schools that are licensed eligible? They're programs that are run within K-8 schools. But they're asking about eligibility for that type of programming.
Yeah, if they are not, so it's the same situation with the Catholic Church, if they are not a separate Chapter 180 tax exempt organization with separate audited financials, then they would not be eligible to apply. If it's a program, an early ed program that is part of the Catholic school, that is a public school that we would be looking at. So they would not be, public schools are not eligible to apply for EEOST funding unless the program within the public school is separate from the school.
Great, thanks, Teresa. And for Bree, are renovations to a swimming pool eligible, and or the installation of a water pad or water play?
So that's a challenging question. So if outdoor improvements, including play areas that benefit licensed childcare program, are eligible. So if you are installing a splash pad outside for the benefit of your licensed childcare program, that would be applicable. For a swimming pool, I think, again, we need more information about that, about the other programs that your organization serves, and whether your child care program has exclusive use of the pool, or whether it would be potentially eligible as a EEOST could go in as a pro rata share of the improvements. But we would need to learn more about your organization and who you serve and those who use the pool. But that's a great question.
So just to emphasize that the emphasis is on features of your facility that are serving the EEC license portion of your program. So that's what would depend on that.
Yeah, but can I add a clarification point? So if you're proposing to do a new entryway to your building, for example, or improvements to a building that serves multiple uses, but you have childcare and other uses, we may look at, again, the proportion of space dedicated to your licensed childcare programs versus the other programs. But again, the intent of EEOST is really to benefit the EEC licensed early education and school-aged components and programs within your building.
And Bree, is there a requirement to hire union workers for prevailing wages for subcontractors or contractors proposed to do the work?
So the EEOST funding itself does not carry any requirements for prevailing wages or union labor. Now, again, if your building has a federal interest or is owned by your city or town, there may be additional requirements for labor that you would need to check out with those entities, but the EEOST funding itself does not trigger any of those compliances.
Great. And another one, Bree and or Neil, for the survey to ensure that we have the 50% income eligibility. If a family has more than one child, do both children have to attend our program in order to count them?
Neil, do you want to take that one?
Sure. If I'm understanding the question correctly, the answer is no. You would just have to, as long as there's a child at the program that whose family is receiving any of the other public subsidies that are specified on the slide and in our guidelines, then they can that child can be counted towards the 50% threshold mentioned. If I'm not understanding the question correctly, I'm happy to add any more detail needed.
Maybe just to add to that, so basically the charts in the application spreadsheets in the Excel are looking at the applicant organization's enrollment, the number of children in that program. So they wouldn't count 2 children if they weren't both attending, but if that makes sense.
Yes, yes.
Correct.
Both children do not have to attend the program in order to count them. Just the one, if there's one.
So we'll be sure to clarify that more. Again, just to reiterate, we're going to type out and answer all of these questions in a document that's going to be posted to Combis. So be sure to look out for that, and we'll send it out when that's posted in, I think, mid-November. So if you have any, doubt at all, it should be listed in that written document. Okay, I know we're coming up on noon, so let me see if we can answer a couple more. We are operating within a synagogue, but operate separately. We do not have separate audited financials. We do have our own financial systems, though. So Teresa, maybe you can answer that, and it's tied to another question of an organization that does not have audited financials. If you could just address that.
So the requirement of the program is that you have audited financials and that you are, if you are part of a religious institution, that it is a program that is separate from that institution in terms of having its own, again, it's a nonprofit, it's tax exempt status, it has separate financials that are not tied to the larger organization.
Great.
Anyone else, Neil, or do you want to add anything to that? And we can spell that out more in the answer when we respond in the Q&A.
And then how about one more, Bree, and someone asked about this too, what constitutes a project? Can we lump several upgrades together in one proposal, for instance, paving, entrance, playground?
You absolutely can. So again, I would specify within the application the timeline and the costs and the different professionals you're hiring to do these different work. So again, if you have an entrance vestibule, you might need an architect or somebody just to opine on the accessibility of it all and make sure that it complies with that code. And then you would have maybe a door fabricator in addition to a general contractor. For other work like a bathroom renovation, again, you might need an architect and a different general contractor potentially to work on the project. But as long as the project is at the same address and the program has the same license, then it is applicable to apply. You can have a host of different smaller projects that constitute the larger project within your application.
Great. So I know we're over time. We still have a couple questions. We will make sure that we address them in the written Q&A as we mentioned, and I'll turn it over to Teresa for any other closeout comments.
Sorry, can't get off mute. So just thank you to everyone. I know we are at time. Again, as Kira mentioned, we will certainly, if you can submit all of your questions to us by November 3rd, and then we will post our responses by November 15th. If you have any other additional questions that you'd like to be answered sooner, if you can send us an email to that email address, and we will make sure that we can start a dialogue with you on some specific questions that you might have, just so that we can make sure we're giving you the correct information before you fill out this application. So thank you all for attending this session today, and good luck with your application. Thank you. Have a great afternoon.